Hey folks, my name is Dwayne France, and I'm a combat veteran and clinical mental health counselor practice in the state of Colorado. I retired from the United States Army in 2014 after 22 years of service. I've had 5 combat and operational deployments within that time. After I retired, I decided to continue my mission of taking care of veterans the same way that I took care of my soldiers, and I obtained a degree in clinical mental health counseling. In my experience in working with not just my colleagues in the clinical mental health community, but also veterans themselves, I began to see that we really need to develop an understanding of sort of the overall aspect of what veterans are dealing with. So back in about March of 2014, I was invited to provide the keynote address to the Military and Government Counseling Association conference at the National Conference, the American Counseling Association. And I presented this conceptual framework of how to view veteran mental health. And so I thought that I would share it for you today. I do many different things in addition to my clinical work. I have a blog which can be found on veteranmentalhealth.com. We also have a podcast which is part of the Change Your POV podcast network. Now this case conceptualization, or this entire mental health conceptualization, is going to be presented in a series of podcasts later on this year, and in preparation for that, I wanted to be able to provide you an overview of some of the stuff that I'm talking about. So if you would, take a few minutes and watch this presentation. So we're going to talk briefly about a way to conceptualize veteran mental health. When many people think about veteran mental health, of course, the first thing they think about is post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. And so those are definitely concerns that many veterans face when it comes to addressing their veteran mental health. We talk about fear and anxiety, these emotional reactions that we have when veterans are faced with a certain trigger, either a loud noise or traffic, for example, or the full moon. Of course, here we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety disorder. This is, in fact, an injury of the behavior. External thing triggers us, and then we actually have a physiological, neurological, behavioral response. Another aspect that people are increasingly familiar with are the physical implications of veteran mental health. Of course, there's dealing with things like injuries and stuff like that, but there's a neurological basis, a physical neurological basis for challenges in veteran mental health, and that includes traumatic brain injury and chronic pain. So whereas post-traumatic stress disorder is an injury of the behavior, traumatic brain injury is really a physical injury of the brain. Many individuals working with veterans, when it comes to veteran mental health, are aware of substance abuse concerns, not just alcohol and its prevalence in the military, but also the use of painkillers and opiate abuse. This kind of thing leads to DUIs, overdoses, and addiction. Now, if these are the only things that someone considers the whole entity of veteran mental health, then we're missing quite a bit. There's depression, and not just depression, but emotional dysregulation, which is separate from PTSD. Of course, it has aspects of each of those three on the bottom, but it also is a standalone concern. Of course, this is leading to major depressive disorder and situations like suicide. Not to say that PTSD, DUI, or substance abuse and TBIs can't lead to suicide. But we need to understand that it is actually something separate. In my experience, there is a lack of purpose and meaning that a lot of veterans have once they leave the military. What do I do with my life? Is the best parts of my life behind me? Of course, that kind of thing leads to disengagement and a lack of motivation, a lack of interest in what they're currently doing, because it's nothing as important as what they used to do. Another concern that many veterans deal with are things like guilt and shame, the guilt that they have around things that they did or didn't do, or shame about the fact that they couldn't help their brothers and sisters in combat. This kind of thing leads to blame, self-condemnation. Again, something very separate from post-traumatic stress disorder and really its own entity and concern. Then many veterans, once they leave the military, they experience frustration. They can't get their needs met for whatever reason. And here we're talking about needs fulfillment, learning how to meet these needs in sort of new ways, fulfilling their employment needs, their housing needs, even their aesthetic needs, the things that they enjoy. And then, of course, we have challenges in relationships. And this is something that many people have identified, that veterans once the change has happened, there are disruptions not just in their marital relationships, but intergenerationally between their kids and them, between their parents and them, intragenerationally, and sort of between their peers. And of course, these kind of challenges lead to divorce, domestic violence, and things like that. There are internal pressures that keep a veteran from seeking veteran mental health services, things like the stigma that they experience, the warrior ethos, this idea of I must be this stoic, strong, capable individual, the whole suck it up and drive it on mentality that many service members learned even as early as basic training. And there are societal external influences. There are situational and systematic causes for their behavior. Many veterans recognize this, and we've known this for decades, really. If you think back to the Stanford prison experiment back in the early 70s about how individuals being put in a certain situation without any restrictions can sort of change the way they think and what they believe is right and wrong. Societal judgment against help seeking, that's actually still a big concern, not just with veteran mental health, but mental health in general. Stigma against help seeking, again, this idea that mental health is something that we sort of don't really talk about very often. We kind of keep to the side. Veterans experience various stereotypes, things like people consider them villains, these angry monsters or things like that. Or maybe people see them as victims, a three-legged bird or three-legged dog or a wounded bird or something like that. Or these mythic heroes that that are going to save the nation. And while none of these are any of us, maybe we have portions of all of them, but that's humanity. Peer judgment is a huge thing. What will my buddies think of me? What will people say if they find out that I'm seeking mental health? And then, of course, the barriers to care that exists. How am I going to pay for it? Where do I get it? Will anybody understand? These things that actually exist in our society that keep veterans from actually addressing what these major concerns are. Now, mental health professionals, the mental health industry, licensed mental health professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, master's level clinicians like LCSWs, LPCs, and LMFTs. We actually have the tools in our toolkit to address each of these if we're fully aware of what the veteran's experiencing. We know for a fact that cognitive behavioral therapy, prolonged exposure, and EMDR do very, very well in addressing PTSD specifically. And we're talking about specifically PTSD. If that's the primary concern and some of these other things aren't a major factor, then we know for a fact that these things work. We know that neurological interventions work when it comes to traumatic brain injury and chronic pain, these things that will help harness the neuroplasticity of the brain to regenerate itself. We absolutely do know that relapse prevention and motivational interviewing do address substance abuse concerns. The aspect of treatment for addictions is well documented. And if this is the primary concern that the veteran is experiencing, then these are the interventions that we can use. There are other theoretical conceptualizations that I've seen have helped me understand working with veterans. Things like Aaron Beck's conceptualization of depression and Seligman and learned helplessness. There are interventions, again, much like cognitive behavioral therapy, or actually cognitive behavioral therapy, but these are things that will address the negative thoughts specifically, separate from post-traumatic stress disorder. Of course, here when we're talking about purpose and meaning, we're talking about existential therapy. And so if we're working with a veteran, the existentialism, the concepts of Frankl and Yalom and Rollo May, these kind of concepts are critical when it's helping the veteran understand what they're dealing with, what the process is, and sort of just trying to make meaning of their past and how do they find meaning in the future. This really has to do with moral injury. And so if you look at Jonathan Shea, Achilles in Vietnam, Brett Litz and Shira Magwin, and their conceptualization of moral injury, again, separate from post-traumatic stress disorder. The challenge is that morally injurious events also could be traumatic events that would develop post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as traumatic brain injury, as well as having the veteran develop substance abuse. But if the root cause analysis is a morally injurious event, then we as mental health professionals need to understand that as separate from post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, here we're talking about Maslow, or we're talking about acceptance and commitment therapy or choice therapy. The fact that we need to learn how to meet new or old needs in new ways. This is something that I see in veterans all the time. It's okay, and it really can tie into the existential piece. But how do I meet these needs? What do I do? How do I actually get my needs met in a peaceful and really a socially acceptable way? And then finally, we do have family systems theory, that there are individuals that can help with reestablishing intragenerational or intergenerational or intramarital concerns that will be able to help with these factors. So there you have it. Just a brief overview of a lot of the different concepts that we work with as mental health professionals and how we can help veterans overcome the challenges that they face. And really, this is an attempt to really integrate the two things together: the knowledge and experience that the mental health professional has and the need that the veteran has to resolve these concerns after their military service. Now, I'm not somebody who believes that a veteran is broken or that they need to be fixed or they're sick or they're ill in some way. My orientation comes to the fact that sometimes we're less well and sometimes we're more well. The idea that we as veterans, speaking from the veteran side, can step out and trust that mental health professionals can address our concerns just as much as we mental health professionals, speaking in from that in my point of view, have the ability and the training and the knowledge and the experience to help veterans with that. And so I appreciate you taking the time to watch this short video, and I look forward to hearing your feedback. Feel free to make comments, feel free to share if you'd like, but also visit us at veteranmentalhealth.com or changeyourpov.com. We're actually going to be continuing this conversation in the near future and really as long as we possibly can. Thank you.